Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. I see several of you continuously, trickling in here. Yep. So I wanted to let you know that we are on the line and we will start promptly at 1 p.m. We'll talk to you then. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for attending today's Altair Global webinar, Does Your Relocation Policy Reflect Your Company Culture? Thank you for taking the time out of your day today to join us on this topic. Before we begin, I would like to take a quick moment to address a few housekeeping items. Please be advised that your phones have been muted by our phone system and you are in listen-only mode. However, technology is never soundproof per se, so it's not a bad idea to go ahead and make sure your phones are muted as well, just for good measure. We do encourage you to submit questions for that reason right there. So please go ahead and mute your phone so we can have a easy to hear audio experience. We do encourage you, however, to submit questions. I apologize, y'all. It seems like we are having some audio technical difficulties. Just once more, I'd like to remind to please mute your phone system. Thank you. Okay, if you do have any questions, please submit that in the question and answer window on your screen. We will do our best to respond to each question at the end of the session. This webinar is being recorded and will be available in a follow-up email after this webinar is concluded. If you do have to jump off for any reason, you can catch the rest of this webinar in the recording. You can also download today's webinar handout in your GoToWebinar control menu for printing and following along. And lastly, this webinar has been approved for continuing education credits through Worldwide ERC and HRCI. The activity IDs will be shared at the end of this webinar. So all right, let's get this started. Our first speaker on today's topic is joining us out of our California office, Brian Potts, Senior Vice President of the Pacific region here at Altair Global. Brian, welcome and thank you for joining today.
Thanks so much, Sarah.
Okay, and our next speaker is joining me here in our new Frisco, Texas headquarters location, Mary Beth Nitz, Vice President of Global Consulting Services. And thank you for joining as well, Mary Beth.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, this is one of our last webinars as we wrap up 2019 here at Altair Global. And with that being said, I wanted to ask y'all, what have been some of your highlights here in 2019?
Brian, you wanna go first there?
Yeah, I certainly for me, I think that, I'll start out with just a personal highlight versus a professional, but we can maybe hit both. But personally, having finally have two children get into high school and seeing the different demands that are being placed onto them in 2019. and some of the rigor of school, some of the different pressures that are in place compared to, I guess, not only when we went to high school, but even our parents. And it's kind of apropos for today's topic, just to see the differences in technology, in physical and political environment that's placed onto them. And so I'm kind of going back through high school again. I feel like a little bit through their experiences. So I'd say that's been a fascinating, really just last 3 months as they've both gone into high school.
That's awesome. How about you, Mary Beth?
Well, okay, so I'll go the professional route, not the personal route. So we had the amazing opportunity to move into a brand new building this year, our corporate headquarters here in Texas, and you can all see our gorgeous building right there. And this has just been a huge highlight of the year because it's something we've actually been talking about and planning for over a year. It was kind of one of those things that we felt would never actually get here. And now here we are in our gorgeous new building. And of course, moving into a new building, you have all sorts of settling in issues and things like that. So we just want to let everybody attending the webinar today know that we just found out in the last hour that we are expecting a fire drill to take place, hopefully after our webinar is over. But if you do start to hear sirens, we will obviously have to log off. Hopefully we can get all the information to you before the fire drill starts.
Right.
Always expect the unexpected.
Exactly. And we will disseminate any information that has not been covered in this webinar in the event that happens. So with that being said, we do have a great webinar in store for y'all. And without further ado, I will hand it over to you to kick it off, Mary Beth.
Great. Thank you. So to get things started, we wanted to sort of set the stage and talk a little bit about perceived generational differences. And I love that word perceived because, it's very easy to stereotype and it's very easy to categorize people. So we just want to kind of walk through this just to make sure everybody's on the same page when we're talking about the different generations. Of course, first we have the traditionalists. Born 1900 to 1945, and these are those people, some of which lived through the Great Depression. I know as the child of a traditionalist, I think my father fits this category perfectly: conservative, hierarchical, clear chain of command, etc. Next up are the baby boomers, born 1946 to 1964. A little bit different: democratic cultures, humane values, equal opportunities, etc. Then we get into Gen X, which I'm proud to call myself a part of, and Brian, I believe you are as well.
Okay.
So valuing workplaces that are positive, fun, informal. We like to have access to leadership and information. Then we come to, our favorite generation, right? That I feel like we've been talking about for years and years. I feel like they get a lot of flack. Our wonderful millennials, or our Gen Y, born 81 to 2000, valuing workplaces that are collaborative, achievement-oriented, creative, etc. And then Gen Z, which is a generation that we've not heard a ton about, I don't think. But interestingly enough, some resources actually categorize Gen Z as individuals, starting with people that were born in the mid-90s. So what you see here on the slide, it says born after 2000. But this can even go back to people that were born in the mid-90s. And according to Forbes, they're motivated by security, maybe more competitive and want some independence. And these are the folks that are just really starting to edge into the workplace and enter the workforce. Brian, any thoughts on that from your end?
Yeah, I love these. I say to folks in jest, stereotypes, they're a real time saver. But, do these blurbs define you? I think it's so hard to distill, a population of people that are born in a period of time just with a few choice adjectives and some collective attributes. I think there's some themes that can be pulled out, but it's more important to realize that the themes are these individuals have been shaped by technology and political and physical environment and external pressures and landscape, and it's materialized into maybe some of these attributes. But it's so important to really get to know the individual before you lump them in. I think that's the rule, right? So they just happen to fall into one of these categories, but don't try to go, oh, you're a millennial, and then you make all these assumptions. It's a very easy trap to get into, but it's something that I think Altair is really trying to get our arms around, and I think we need to understand that these differences, they're not that large, and trying to distill into a few adjectives is too hard. I think, one of the things that comes up to me right away, just in classroom structure, as I hit upon earlier in my intro, for baby boomers and even Gen Xers, your classroom structure was individual rows, right? Very traditional, and you had individual work. And now we come into a different situation where, let's say, millennials or Gen Y, they had a lot of circular rows and set up in classrooms. I've seen that through the younger generation, and some collective work, some individual work. And now you're getting into this new generation where there's virtual rows, right? And the work is so different. So that kind of formative year environment and those formative years, it's going to have an impact on how they learn and how they, I think, report out. And so I think that's why some of these differences are in place, right? Some of these experiences, not only at educational front, but elsewhere.
Yep, agreed, absolutely.
And one thing I just have to comment on the Gen Z, which, I don't know if we can have a generation after that. We're out of letters in the alphabet, but you see it says face to face, wants to communicate face to face. So my daughter lost her phone last week, and I offered her the landline, and absolutely just looked at me like, well, A, I don't know their number, and B, I don't want to talk to them if I can't see them. And think about how that's affected some of our millennials. But I'm coming back into the workplace now. How can you conduct a meeting, and if everybody's not in physical attendance, without seeing them? And we see that with some of our client bases, that if you're virtual, you're on video. And so I think that we're going to challenge Altair that webinars in 2020 and going forward, you'll get to see us, because I think that's where this is going, and you see this with this next generation.
I would agree. With 3 kids in the Gen Z generation, I would absolutely agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
So let's move on and talk about how different these generations really are. We just kind of went through the stereotypes. Brian, I loved your comment about how it's very efficient to stereotype. And we mentioned, older generations desiring stability and valuing hierarchy, and younger generations desiring flexibility and purpose. And Brian, you brought up a great point. The advent of this digital world and all of this technology, and not just digitalization, but the speed at which everything happens, which just seems to increase exponentially, really is reshaping and bringing to light more challenges and new challenges for all the generations. And the other piece that I just wanted to touch on, and we did a piece on this in one of our, I think it was actually last year, our 2018 Global Trends Report that Altair Global published, talking about retiring the term millennial. And as part of our research for that piece, we went back and found some articles from the 50s, from the 90s, and even before, that had themes where they talked about the laziness of the younger generation, the complaining and the self-absorption. I thought that was really interesting. There was one from 1951 that said many young people were so pampered that they had forgotten there was such a thing as walking, and they automatically made their way to the buses. So we're worried that the future of walking is going to be dead. It was in 1951. So, and then another one from the Washington Post in 1993, which unfortunately I think was speaking to my generation, our Generation X, that said what really distinguishes this generation from those before it is that it's the first generation in American history to live so well and complain so bitterly about it. So I guess the whole point of that is, it's always kind of a stereotype of that younger generation. Whatever period of time you're in, there's always that sort of, oh, they're lazy, they're this. It's really not just the millennials. So, and I think too, some of those characteristics that we attribute to the younger generations, at least where we are now, especially because of the digitalization, are really going to be influencing and are already influencing the work habits and those attitudes of those older generations that are still in the workforce.
That's good stuff. I think from the region that I lead out here in Walnut Creek in California for Altair, the differences, I think they're much smaller versus larger, right?
Yeah.
Our region that out here has tripled and then tripled again over the last 11 years. And so we've had quite an influx of, let's say, different generational talent mixing together. And there are communication style differentiations. I see that there's collaboration skill set variances, but they're minor versus major. And so, so I think some of our challenges have just been to, first of all, create an open environment, and create that emotional space that's flexible from an understanding statement that, to appreciate that people did grow up in different environments and to listen before judging. But I think that the company also has some requirements to change the physical space, right? I mean, that's certainly an important thing. It'll help facilitate that exact same situation. So, looking at your space, older generations loved me space, right? This is my spot, whether it's my desk, my office, what have you. But transitioning that to we space and getting into having collaboration areas within the space, that seems to be much more progressive and creates some of that dialogue that you want to have happen. And what invariably has happened just since we did our office space, and I'm excited to see the differences in Frisco, Mary Beth, where you and Sarah are at over the period. But what had happened here is all those differences that might have been perceived as large, really with that collaborations have just reduced down to minimal. They're not major at all. In fact, it's more learning from each other versus judging.
Yep, I would agree. So I think for our attendees, we are going to move into our very first polling question. And this polling question is, what generations are most active in the workforce today? And you can see that you can select all that apply. So you don't have to pick just one, but from your perception, what generations do you feel are most active in the workforce today? And Brian, I believe you had kind of an interesting stat you were going to share as well while this poll was taking place.
Yeah, just a comment. Just doing some research, and the Pew Research had some great stats and a fairly good reputation. One thing that was almost counterintuitive, but millennial workers, we'll use that term for the moment, are just as likely to stick with their employers as Gen X workers were when they were at the same age. And fascinating, right? So roughly 8 in 10 millennials aged 22 to 37 in 2018, about 80%, which was the same stat of Gen Xers in 2002. So kind of fascinating that, again, are we just repackaging some of this terminology and some of this language? So not a major difference there at all.
Mm-hmm. And that's interesting because it isn't something you always tend to hear about, quote unquote, millennials, right? Is that they're not loyal. But that's a very interesting statistic. Mm-hmm. And it looks like based on our polling, 88% of our attendees said Generation X is most active. 74% said millennials. I think this is probably pretty consistent with what with what I would say for sure. That baby boomers are a little bit less active. Gen Z, obviously, they're just starting to join the workforce. So some interesting thoughts here from our panel.
Mary Beth, I would just say really quickly that, again, according to Pew, for the U.S. labor force, and this was just completed at the end of 18, the stats, they had 35% of the workforce was millennials, 33% Gen X, and baby boomers at 25%. So that was that new category that millennials had jumped over Gen X in the workforce percentages. Yeah, just barely though, but pretty neck and neck.
So it's interesting because really for the first time, at least according to human resources experts, we're seeing that this is the first time in contemporary history that 4 generations are in the workforce together. So it's obviously a very culturally dynamic workforce. And those are the exact 4 generations that we asked you to in the polling question: baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and Gen Z. The other interesting thing that we discovered too is that the full retirement age is consistently increasing and will continue to increase. The full retirement age used to be 65 for those born in 1937 or earlier, which I know that sounds like a really long time ago. Individuals born between 43 and 54 had a full retirement age of 66. Again, that's only a year, so it seems like a small increase, but it's pretty significant in terms when you think about the workforce. Full retirement age right now is 66 years and 6 months, and this is a 2-month increase over those born in 1956. The full retirement age will further increase in 2-month increments each year until it hits 67 for anyone born in 1960 or later. So again, it sounds like a small going from 65 to 67, but really, what's the implication of that, right? When we started talking or hearing a lot about the aging workforce several years ago, the big concern, I think, was, oh my goodness, there's going to be a huge brain drain. All of these boomers and these older workers are going to start retiring, and they're going to start leaving the workforce. And so the focus was on mitigating the loss of that knowledge in the workplace when those boomers retired by ensuring that the knowledge was being passed down to the younger workers. And what's really happened is there's been sort of an epiphany that type of thinking is very unidirectional. And what we've gotten to is older workers transferring knowledge to younger workers has really turned into thinking more about helping all the different generations of workers to exchange knowledge. And Brian, this totally, when you just made the comment about more we space and collaboration spaces, that tied right into this. Like, it's not about just transfer the knowledge from the more experienced older workers to the younger workers, but exchange knowledge between all of those generations. So I think that's what we really see happening. We're moving away from that whole, the older workforce leaving, or the older generation leaving the workforce, and they're still in it, right? They're obviously with the retirement age increasing.
Yeah, and I was looking at those stats and talking about 35% of the workforce, was millennial, and 33 Gen, 25 baby boomers. The predicted analytics on that was that would hold firm for a little while. To your point, that the baby boomers aren't necessarily retiring at the same rate that the traditionalists did. So to your point, who came up with that? It was a hierarchical, transfer of knowledge. I'm pretty sure that that was our legacy workforce, and we're certainly not saying that. It's definitely more the arrow flowing both ways as we think and work differently now. It isn't a transfer from old to new.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit. Obviously, I think we've done a really good job talking about the generations and the workforce and the differences. So let's kind of bring this into play in terms of mobility. Some things, we've talked about differences, but we've also talked about how, there are differences, but in the end, a lot of things really stay the same. And when we talk about relocation and supporting our employees who are relocating, some things definitely do remain the same. Relocating employees in general continue to have the same core basic needs, right? Get me, get my stuff, and get my family from A to B. Pretty simple. With that said, relocating employees have unique personal circumstances and situations. That's really never been different. I mean, relocating employees have always had unique personal circumstances and situations, and maybe it's just now with all these different generations in the workforce that companies are kind of starting to pay more attention to this, that wow, there are a lot of unique situations out there, and our program really needs to be reflecting that and addressing that. And then again, organizations having consistent business goals and objectives. Organizations continue to move their talent. And why do they do that? They're growing business, they're exchanging and transferring knowledge. That really hasn't changed. The goal in moving somebody is for that person to be productive, to do it as efficiently as possible, but also ensure that individual has their needs met. So let's weave this in to company culture. And what is it? And I was so excited when I found out that this was the topic for the webinar, because just a few weeks ago, Altair as an organization had had the opportunity to sponsor a talent attraction panel discussion through the Dallas Regional Chamber. And it was phenomenal. There were panelists from Southwest Airlines, Capital One, Alchemy Technology, and another organization. It was a smaller startup company. And a lot of the conversation was around culture and what it is. And I loved Adrienne Court, she's Chief Human Resources Officer for Alchemy Technology, said for her organization, culture is how you think, act, and connect. I also did a little bit of research on this, and I found an article from HubSpot that defines company culture as values, behaviors, and shared vision that contribute to the environment of an organization. So, but what is it? What is culture, and how do we sell that culture? How do we get that people to understand, especially talent, right? Especially talent that we're trying to recruit. How do we communicate that culture? And a lot of the panelists agreed that a company has to sell culture plus. So what does that mean? And I'll kind of also partner this with a stat that I found in a recent Deloitte study. 80% of organizations cited culture and engagement as their top challenges. So I thought that was very interesting. Based on the panel, they felt that, a value proposition is key. You can't just say, oh, our company has a great culture. You have to take it to the next level, right? You have to take it a step further and promote what your culture offers the candidate from a value perspective. So what is that value proposition? For that candidate, what they're thinking is, that's great that you think you have a great culture, but what does that mean for me? What do I get to do? So what that really means is that as an organization, you have to be intentional about your culture, and it really has to be bred and infiltrated in throughout everything that you do. And when we talk about recruiting talent, a lot of the message that came out of this fantastic panel as well was customizing those recruiting efforts, right? So it kind of gets into that whole one size fits all, and that really doesn't work anymore. So when you're trying to recruit talent, you really have to customize those efforts. Who is that person you're trying to recruit? What do they want to do? What do you want them to do for your organization? And customize your recruiting efforts around that. And Brian, I know you have some thoughts on that.
Well, I'll take a different slant on this in terms of company culture. I do, and I'll talk about the companies that, from this region's perspective and how it relates to policy a little bit. So, and to your point, it's about, everybody has the same basic benefits and mobility. So sometimes it's best not to overthink it. But I would say that we have clients in our portfolio in this region whose culture and maybe even business environment can be considered traditional. They may only have a few true competitors in their space and a mature phase of their business life cycle. Okay, so their mobility policy should be consistent with that, especially if their culture aligns with that, even if their target hires are mostly millennials and some Gen X, right? And they're skewing younger. So, man, if we've had conversations, well, I need to maybe think about core flex or no, not necessarily. If that's not going to align with your culture and the end user experience, and that's going to seem very off, even if that's your target base, you can have a traditional policy and plan, and the core flex is not necessarily going to be less expensive or more conducive to the experience for that new target hire group. So I think it's an important differentiation that it's important to align with the culture first versus to take, let's say a newfangled approach because that's your target hire. Now compare and contrast that though with we have some clients that have a very specific culture that they've believed differentiates themselves from other companies strongly. Maybe they're non-traditional, and maybe they're in the growth phase of their business cycle. So their mobility policy can reflect that uniqueness and certainly I'll be consistent with their culture. That may be where a core flex may be, the perfect choice. It may not necessarily be less costly, but it may more align with how other benefits in their organization function, or the other experiences that their employees are going to face as they onboard and then work there. And so I think there's room for both. It's still important to understand first, what is your culture? How is that going to be carried out in a mobility policy? And does that align going forward?
Those are great points, absolutely. And I did have a comment, but I think I'm going to save it.
No.
I think I'm going to save it for the next slide. So I'll let you take us into the next polling question, Brian.
All right. So we thought we would ask, as we've talked about culture a little bit, and it's varying degrees with our different corporate clients about how strong that culture is. But do you feel confident that you know what your company culture is? So a basic question, but important one to think about, because we certainly see some variances just even in our client portfolio. So yes, no, somewhat, should be rather quick, but.
And this is a great question, because honestly, when myself and my team are working with our clients on policy development, and you were just talking a little bit about that, Brian, it's one of the first questions that we'll ask is, what's your company's culture? And it's interesting how many people will say, oh, well, we're kind of this and we're kind of that. So I think this is a very relevant question to ask. Yeah.
But sometimes when you
what we have here.
Sometimes when you ask that culture question, there's 3 paragraphs worth of information. So it's a very important fact for us to get.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so let's look and see what our results are. This is great. 66% of our attendees said yes, they feel confident that they know what their company's culture is. 28% said somewhat. And, I think that's perfectly fine. Again, I hear that from a lot of organizations that, well, yeah, I think we're like this, but maybe not 100% sure. I'm very glad to see that only 6% said no.
Yeah, right. I think that we expected that to be on the low end. Where the percentages were on the yes or somewhat was going to be debatable right. about that on that spectrum. But in either case, I think the mobility policies for those organizations can be tailored towards what is known about the culture, so that it aligns for the moment. And if it changes in the future, that's when you revise and adjust. Let me kick off the next slide, if I could. And this is alignment of company culture and mobility program. And what I think what we're seeing collectively as an RMC, as a relocation management company on the Altair side, is, the mobility program is certainly more than just about policy. And that's certainly a change from, 20 years ago. I'll date myself a little bit, but sometimes 10 years ago, right? 8 years ago. And so as talent acquisition has come into this space, and so much of the mobility programs now fall under either total rewards or TA in organizations that we partner with, the mobility program becomes all about a strategy. And if a company is outsourcing their program, which of course they should, but
shameless plug.
But if they do, you've got to iterate all the way back in terms of, am I with the right RMC? I mean, and this won't be an Altair commercial, but am I with the right RMC? Because there are differentiations out there in relocation management companies, and it's more than just a policy. It's going to be about the experience of what that employee goes through and how important that is to the clients that we work with. And that ties in again to their culture, their expectations, how other things function in not only the HR space, but in their overall company's approach to how they treat their employees. So I think you've got to iterate that all the way back. Am I with the right RMC? And then, okay, fine. If that decision's made, now how are we going to shape our policy? And then that policy goes way beyond just the benefit packages that take care of, moving existing talent or moving new hires, right? Or even interns. We're getting into where it's all part of the candidate experience and pre-decision and getting involved that early on, because this is going to be an A to Z experience for that employee. And we're part of the talent acquisition strategy. And so aligning that all together with the onboarding of new employees and selecting those and integrating them into their culture, selecting that right RMC partner to help in that endeavor is the true alignment, frankly, of company culture and program.
Right, right. To your point that your partners should be a true extension of you and an extension of your culture. So,
and I think
Brian, something. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No. I think if that's important to clients, then they should that should be thought of and should be taken care of. Again, not all of our corporate clients go to that level of detail, but I think if that's where your organization is, and that's something that we're certainly seeing.
Right. And something you said earlier just kind of spurred something in my mind, and we talked about this a lot when, the leading up to this webinar and the prep that we did. We talked a lot about if an organization has a more traditional culture, a more hierarchical culture, and to your point, that core flex or that more progressive mobility program may not be the right place for them to be, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. We talked about that, right? And it just made me think too, quite honestly, if there is disconnect between an organization's culture and their approach from a mobility program standpoint, that's noticeable. And that can have a significant impact on the candidate and employee experience. So again, not every policy and not every program has to be, innovative and cutting edge and core flex and everything. It's more important, I think, that it does align with your corporate culture, because otherwise it's sending a very disjointed message to the talent that you're trying to attract and retain.
Yeah, and that's more than fair. And that's why it's important, how strong is that culture? How differentiable is that culture in the company's, opinion? And then what's the right talent mobility strategy to follow? And so I think
you just made up a new word.
I did. But, there's all kinds of new words in mobility. Transferee, for example. So I think that hopefully kind of just sparking some thoughts and ideas as our listeners, look at a macro position of their organization and their talent mobility strategy, and then how does that go all the way down to policy and program?
Yeah, I think it's important to note that culture doesn't change overnight. It's not the flick of a switch where you're gonna change your culture. So it's more important to embrace what you have, and if a change is desirable, it's going to take time and it's going to take buy-in.
So kind of continuing with that. Let me just go to a third polling question, because I think it's interesting. If we talk about the comparative factor now, you've looked at your company, you feel like either your culture, yes, no, somewhat, we went through that. Do you think your culture is unique compared to other organizations? Of course, this is an opinion question, but I'm interested in, and we're interested to see where our attendees fall on this spectrum.
I think it's a very thought-provoking question, because we asked about, do you feel confident that you know what your company's culture is, and now we're saying, so assuming that you do, is your culture unique? Right,
because then how much do you need to differentiate your program in your opinion for your talent acquisition strategy?
Right. Okay, so this is great. Thank you to everybody that's voting, because we're getting some good results coming in here. It looks like we're definitely, we have a lot of people that think their culture is unique. And that's great. We're going to share the results here in just a minute. There we go. So yeah, total 87% of our attendees, you all said that you either strongly agree or somewhat agree that your organization's culture is unique compared to other organizations. 3% strongly disagree and 10% somewhat disagree. Brian, what do you think about that?
Well, I think with the population attending, then thinking through that requires some attention to detail onto your program, your policy, and your relocation management company. I think. And to make sure that if your culture is that specific, is my mobility policy and program in sync with that? And I think that to me, it's a fantastic high percentage And it's important for companies to have a definable culture, right? I think that's a critical aspect of any company, frankly, right? These are social constructs that we create, and I think that companies need to differentiate who they are, what they stand for, and how they're going to function, frankly, in society. So I think this gets back down to, what do we need to do? Is our policy right now 2019 and our program? And if it's not, what should we be doing? And I think that's the right conversation topic back internally, not only with your HR leadership, but also potentially your outsourced provider.
I agree. Well, let's talk a little bit about mobility as a talent attraction and retention tool. And something that just occurred to me when we were looking at the results from that last poll, and the huge number of people that said that they do agree that their organization's culture is unique. I think that another important aspect, and it's not on this slide, it's something that just occurred to me, is not just knowing and agreeing and feeling that your organization's culture is unique, but being able to articulate that culture as well. That is incredibly important, and that's really where it becomes a huge talent attraction tool. It's great to say, yes, our culture is unique, but to be able to articulate how is really important. So in terms of mobility as a talent attraction and retention tool, I kind of wanted to take this or come at this from a different standpoint. I read an article from Mercer recently, how global mobility is responding to new dilemmas, and I read something in there I thought was really interesting. I guess there's a perception, or there is a widespread recruitment bias against older workers, and that's could be conscious or unconscious, but that can very well be reflected in the priority given to younger professionals. So this kind of came out of some research that Mercer did, and the whole point of the article was that ignoring those older generations, or at least failing to accommodate their specific requirements, can be a huge risk for an organization. And obviously, if we go back and talk about, that there are 4 generations in the workforce today, I think that's really key. So do we get too focused on how to make our policies more attractive for younger generations, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but in doing so, do we forget about the older generations? So we talked a lot when we were categorizing the generations, and we talked about flexibility. Well, it's not just for younger generations. And if you think about it, a lot of your older workers or your employees may be empty nesters, and they may have a much higher degree of financial flexibility. And they may be open to voluntary relocation just as much as maybe those younger workers are. So having some sort of voluntary relocation option, I think, is really important, not just for younger generations, but for older generations as well. I also thought it was really interesting to find that companies are really looking into intergeneration coaching. So taking those digital skills that are probably really strong with the younger generations, and Brian, you were saying, just like what I experienced with my kids wanting to do FaceTime and things like that, and having that knowledge exchange for some of those softer skills and that market experience that those older generations have. So being able to facilitate within your organization, I think, is important. And then when we look at mobility in terms of assignments, again, not just knowledge transfer assignments, which we've heard a lot of short-term assignments might be called, that's a knowledge transfer assignment. But let's think about those in a different way and have those be knowledge exchange assignments. And maybe it's that older worker that's going to be sent on that short-term assignment to help with the exchange of that knowledge and that experience. And just a couple additional things, financial counseling for those nearing retirement. Could that be a part of your mobility program? And it's kind of that whole beyond the organization. You want that person to be a cheerleader for your organization when and if they do retire from your company. So just some things to think about in terms of expanding or maybe enhancing your current programs.
Yeah, and Mary Beth, I'll add one thing as a takeaway here. And maybe a little bit more just macro from an information exchange. Folks that are responsible for their programs on our corporate clients, doing the research, making good decisions, partnering with their RMC to get benchmarking data and get the right program and policy in place. one of the things that could be very valuable, and we're seeing it within our own organization, is actually, hearing directly from our folks. So making sure that you can get a survey of a population of recently relocated people within your org, and asking them some specific questions that give you data points and feedback. And an example question could be, did your relocation or transfer help create a talent retention in their mind? And so getting that feedback and harnessing that data to actually not speculate or guess that you've got the right program in place, but actually hearing from your own people. And so exploring, that situation out there more and more, and not just a survey from an RMC necessarily on how was the move, but drilling down a little bit farther along in that process, I think can be done to gain some more insight that maybe hasn't been done in the past.
Great point. I would agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're going to move on to some questions. So we want to see if any of our attendees, just in terms of our increasing apprehension around our fire drill, I think we're going to just maybe take one question.
Yeah, so let's take a look here. I do see that a few of you have submitted questions. We're going to take, I think, one right now with the time that we have. So please be advised, if we're not using your question, we will reach out at a later time with an email follow-up and make sure to answer that as thoroughly as possible. So let's see, let's go with this one. When benchmarking policy options, is it better to benchmark against like industry or size of company or both?
So I'll take that one.
Sure.
Given that's a lot of what my team does.
Yeah.
That's an interesting question and it's actually one that we get a lot. A lot of companies just kind of default to, well, we want to benchmark against our competitors, and that's not a bad thing. Certainly not. I think really the question needs to go back to, why are you benchmarking in the first place? What is the goal in your benchmarking? Is it just a pulse check? Like, hey, are we doing everything, the stuff that everybody else is doing? Or is it we want to know what are some of those cutting edge, creative things that companies are inserting into their programs? And if that's your goal, then maybe benchmarking against your direct competitors isn't the best option. Maybe you want to benchmark against companies where you want the same talent that other organization is going after. And that's really where that benchmarking might be a better focus, or even other companies that are recruiting in the same market that you're in. They may not be in the same industry, the same size, but you're going after the same talent. And I think that obviously aligns with our topic today too, is your mobility program as a talent attraction and retention tool.
Awesome. Okay, well, as Mary Beth mentioned, in light of our upcoming fire drill, I don't want to blow out your eardrums. So with that, we appreciate your attendance in today's webinar. Any questions, like I said, that were not followed up with now will be followed up at a later time. As mentioned previously, this webinar has been approved for HRCI and GMS CRP credit. You can see the activity IDs listed here, so go ahead and jot them down. They are also available in that downloadable handout for your convenience if you need to use it at a later time. And with that, from all of us here at Altair Global, we want to thank you for attending today, and we wish you a great rest of your day. Take care, y'all.